Welcome back to Left of Boom. I'm your host, Military.com managing editor Hope Hodge-Seck. It's not often that you'll see generals and admirals walking around with a novel tucked under their arm, but if you do, there's a solid chance it's one written by Dr. Peter Singer and August Cole. These military technologists have pioneered a way to bring future warfare scenarios to life through gripping fiction that is as fun to read as it is terrifying to envision. Their first collaborative novel, Ghost Fleet, ended up on the Marine Corps' professional reading list and spurred a wave of military pitching and innovation events. Their most recent book, Burn In, released in 2020, contains another round of eerie scenarios and predictions that are rapidly coming true. Today, we'll talk about the most cutting-edge technologies shaping the military and how they're likely to affect future warfare forever. Peter Singer and August Cole, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
Thanks so much for having us.
You've now, as a team, written 2 books predicting the future, or at least a future, for the military and defense. You've made a lot of predictions along the way, backed meticulously by reporting and science with lots of endnotes and citations. I'll ask individually, for each of you, which prediction have you been most amazed to see come true? And let's go ahead and start with August.
In writing both Ghost Fleet and Burn In, our goal was to create a vision of the future that was credible, right, based on real world research. And yet within that, right, as you said, we are trying to conjure up this vision of the future that seems like it's credible, but also is going to stretch people's imagination. Within Ghost Fleet, one of the really important, I think, things that we were thinking about when the book was written, which is, a couple of years before it came out in 2015, was really like the assertiveness that China is going to be demonstrating, not only in its own area of influence in the Pacific, but globally. And, that's less a technological waypoint, but one that I think is probably as significant or more, particularly looking at like how they're spending on defense, the prioritization of the PLA, within the kind of political military relationship there. So I think like in Ghost Fleet, for me, just feeling like having had some time to think since the book came out about how that, prediction, if you want to call it that, has come true. In Burn In, I think having, written a book that depicted a lot of the technological transformation ushered in by COVID so much faster in many cases than, people even in the industries like, the remote work, online shopping, et cetera, have predicted has been really, really interesting to see because there's societal implications, especially national security ones too. And so that acceleration of everything from the virtualization of really critical parts of society and all the vulnerabilities that induces and brings forth, seemed to be something that we felt like, or I felt like at least, we had some runway before we really had to confront. And, in the last 12 months, we've seen that moment is already here. And in fact, we're already falling behind.
It's been remarkable how we've kind of landed in a post-apocalyptic future in 2020, and a whole range of scenarios now seem more plausible. Peter, can I ask you the same question? Which predictions have you been most surprised to see come true?
It's interesting. What we're after with these books is what we call useful fiction, and it's a combination of nonfiction research. So we're hoping to share important data on, everything from, how does AI work to, as August mentioned, here's how you need to think about the future of geopolitics. So in some ways, it's a cross of sort of explanation and prediction. In certain situations, there's things that we're not saying, this will be the specific scenario, but rather we're using that scenario to explain how something works. But then we're adding in that dose of scenario, that dose of fiction. We sometimes think of it as the equivalent of sneaking fruit and veggies into a smoothie, except for policymakers, and readers who are, not going to read that PowerPoint or that white paper, but they can get the good stuff this way. So if science fiction is the milkshake and, that chalky breakfast diet drink is the white paper, we're after that thing in the middle. So I would hit 2 things, and one's to ping off of what August said. I think what I'm most proud of from Ghost Fleet is how we laid out in it a series of threats. You go back in time, we were talking about the dangers of not just cyber threats, but within the supply chain, and how this would hit everything from weapon systems like F-35 to critical infrastructure. there's a series of these that have played out in reality. But I think what I'm most proud of is that there are certain things in Ghost Fleet that won't come true because of Ghost Fleet. That is, senior leaders read it and said, is this true? Could this happen? And then they sent their staff off to, go find out. And they said, yeah, it could. And then they put into place policies that'll prevent that from happening. So in many ways, it's kind of the parallel of in the intelligence game. The best kind of prediction, if you're working intelligence, is the one that you keep from coming true. So the supply chain security one is one that I'm particularly proud of. Obviously, that problem's not gone away, but we paid attention to it, and I think highlighted it for people in a way that drove certain kind of activity. In the more recent book, Burn-In, which was really trying to be a primer of the next generation of technology change and what's going on in AI and Internet of Things. Gosh, the last year we've seen so much in the book that we were playing out as dystopian actually come true. And it was everything from technical side, the hack of a water system where, the hacker is not stealing information, but changing the chemical levels to poison it. We had a scene in the book that played out. And of course, if you follow the news, it happened in Florida just a couple of weeks ago. We thought we had these really dystopian scenes of a riot on the National Mall to a high militarized wall thrown up around the White House to riot cops gathered around the base of the Lincoln Memorial. These were our dystopian scenes that we, conceived of circa 2019 as like, don't let these stuff happen. And then, plays out in 2020. So it's funny, several people kind of pushed back at the more recent book and they're like, hey guys, your stuff keeps coming true, including the bad stuff. Can you write romantic comedies next or something like that?
Oh my goodness, I have chills as you're talking about that. To back up a little bit, could you go into more detail about one or two of the cases where a senior military leader has read your book and then kind of taken it for action and made a practical change or redirected energy?
I'll hit that. We had a series of this impact that play out and in all sorts of different venues. And, let me kind of pull back on this and say it's been incredibly just thrilling for August and I. We both come out of the nonfiction world and we still play in that. I've written a series of books, on the different military reading lists on robotics to cyber to social media. August was the defense beat reporter for Wall Street Journal. That inspiration on the F-35 and supply chain. I mean, he was the guy who broke the story on hacks of the F-35 back in the day. So we came out of that world, and yet it's the useful fiction side that's had the most impact in our careers. And it's everything from, anecdotes of 2 4-stars shared this one with us where they're meeting in the tank, the conference room inside the Pentagon, and one of them yawns and the other says, why are you tired? And he says, well, I was up late at night last night reading this book, kept me up. And, why did it keep you up? And he talks about a certain scenario in it, something that played out in Ghost Fleet. Whoa, could that really happen? And they actually tasked their officers to go off and could this really happen? They included the footnotes in the book. So here's the data on it. We investigate further. Yes, it could happen. Let's prevent that. In fact, Ghost Fleet spawned 3 different investigations, both within DoD and GAO. There's a $3.6 billion Navy program called Ghost Fleet on unmanned systems. They gave us $0 for it. But, so there's been those kind of stories. We've had officers reach out, a unit in Hawaii that said, we built a training exercise around a scenario in the book. There were changes in the Army captain's training that came out of it. But again, those are like the specific policies. What we hope is more just helping people to understand larger trends. Put some hard data on you. 91% of leaders say, hey, AI is the most important new technology out there. 14% of leaders say, I understand how it works, the ways that it's going to be used. And the reality is most of them are not going to go read a white paper on AI. But if they read Burn-In, they get the entertainment of the novel, but they also walk away from it knowing, okay, here's how AI works. Here's the way that it might be used by everyone from Amazon to special forces. Here's some of the dilemmas that come out of it, like algorithmic bias. So you're going to learn that and you'll enjoy it along the way. We've been able, despite it being the middle of a pandemic, we've shared that insight. We've talked to groups about burn-in that range from you to CIA, Joint Chiefs, allied militaries that range from Britain to Australia to Canada to multiple members of the new cabinet. It was even got the opportunity to brief Biden himself. This was before the book came out, but it was during the period of the research for it. So this strangeness of work for a novel leading to real world explanation. And, so hopefully all these people, whether it's, young lieutenants all the way up to members of the cabinet, will walk away from it a little bit more informed, understanding key issues. And that's really exciting. But also, oh, by the way, even if they're not, hopefully just people are entertained. We love our characters. They're our kids. And we really want people to meet Laura Keegan, the dastardly villain. Keegan's the hero, is the former Marine. We want to learn about her partner, the dastardly villain. So as much as you want to share the insight, you also just want people to get that escape to enjoy it.
I love that.
There's an aspect to this too, where in working on, a fiction project, you're using storytelling, to connect with people. And so, when you see signs that it's working, which I think, every writer is always trying to understand, how can I have an effect? And I think for me personally, and I'd speak for Pete too, our work is very much written with that intent. If I can say that a short story I've written or a novel or, some workshop, has helped somebody think with new tools, right, to anticipate a future threat, to make sure that something that they envision doesn't actually happen, that's like a successful outcome. And absolutely, writing something entertaining is important, because one of the most important, two really important rules in writing, I think, one is like get your draft done, and secondly is get your reader to the end of what you've written. And the way that manifests is like, in the Pentagon, I just was talking to someone last week, and they're like, telling me how people are using ghost fleeted as a verb, like, don't get ghost fleeted, don't get hacked, don't let your supply chain get owned. Similarly, a couple of years ago, when General Scott Miller was at Fort Benning at the Maneuver Center of Excellence, he was telling, some of the captains there, you got to ghost fleet up your briefs, right? Like, give me some narrative, give me some, some fiction in there. And so those small, I think, indicators like that, I think are actually really important. And, stepping back too, we certainly are at a moment when these alternative approaches to thinking and writing about the future and sharing ideas are needed more than ever. And so, this phrase ficant, which is like, a shorthand, if you will, for kind of what we're talking about here with books like Ghost Fleet, is being used more and more broadly and widely. And that to me, I think, speaks to the importance of trying to connect with readers who are ultimately writers across military and government communities through, to include allies. Because we're trying to come up with these novel ways to think about some of these very complex technological, social, political, and importantly, economic trends like burn-in does too.
Hope, can I share with you a specific example of this that was really fun, but also I think shows the power of this approach? So with Burn-In and Ghost Fleet, those were our projects. We decided the topic of AI was really important, or with Ghost Fleet, we decided the topic of thinking about a U.S.-China conflict was really important. And it's funny, to go back in time when we were doing that, that was an anomaly. It was back in the period of everybody focused on coin and counterterrorism. Today, of course, U.S.-China, but we had a recent experience that I think illustrates the power of this, where the Australian Defence Force, the Australian military, had a white paper on their professional military education strategy plans for the next 10 years. Now, that honestly is kind of a dry topic, but it's a very important topic. And they asked us to transform that project into a visualization, both to get a wider readership for it, but also to help make the case for these kind of needed changes as, we have the world around them swirling of, new defense needs and education, new technology alike. So we took that dry paper, turned it into a short story, but it's a short story that baked into it are the key themes of their paper. So the scenario is you follow a young officer from her time in War College to her time out on, an exciting mission. But along the way, baked into it are 37 tidbits of everything from, what is virtual reality and distance learning going to do to professional military education, to what's next in Chinese drone tactics. But what was exciting about this package is not only did it get a wider readership than you would normally have with, a strategy paper for PME, but it was read all the way up to the level of their chief of their defense force, who actually attended an event for the launch of it. And to me, that crystallizes the power of bringing together narrative, prediction, but also doing it with a purpose. To what August was saying, we had an audience in mind, so influence in mind, and you could bring it together on a topic as dry as, frankly, professional military education reform.
And the military actually has a tendency to make even very interesting topics and technologies boring. So it's very important to have the antidote to that. August, I did want to return to something you said early on about how the pandemic has really boosted or accelerated a lot of different technologies in the way that we use them. And specifically for the military, can you go into detail in some ways that you're seeing that happen?
Well, it's always, for me, something that I'm looking for, which is trends in civilian society that are changing how conflict is being carried out. And I guess, in a society like ours, the military, of course, reflects civilian society first because we're an all-volunteer force. And at the same time, a lot of the challenges that American society is grappling with are, in effect, becoming the military's challenges. The recent stand down to talk about domestic extremism, I think, is a really significant one, that the pandemic has revealed fault lines in the US that are going to be something we're wrestling with through the 2020s and into the 2030s. This is very much what Burn-In was about, like wrestling with these forces that are being exacerbated by economic dislocation, changes of people's position in society through elements often algorithmically driven, they're out of their control. And so, this downside or this risk factor, I think, is one of the byproducts of the pandemic that our military has to think about, because it is, of course, tied to the transition that our society has in its economy and other parts of society around technological change. But when I think, too, about just stepping back and looking at the shift in civilian society and government to remote work is extraordinary. I mean, what that means for the way people share and communicate and work together is fantastically useful in many cases for stress testing the system that we have in a great power or big war context, whatever label you want to put on it. A distributed society theoretically should be one that is more resilient in this regard. The ability to mobilize and create national intent, if not will, is going to be vital, for the kind of contests that our national defense strategy is potentially envisioning. At the same time, I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss, right? And I'm also incredibly worried by our inability at certain critical moments to kind of overcome some of those challenges, particularly at the political level, where there's a lot of exploitation of the division in our society. Now, that's just not going to work if we're in the kind of military scenarios that we're seeing. And so the partisanship that we've seen in the midst of this horrendous pandemic, where over 500,000 Americans have died, is something that is also, elemental. And so it is less of a technological question at the moment to me than one of looking at some of these structural aspects that tech is a part of. There was a tweet I saw this morning from Sam Bendit, who's one of my favorite CNA analysts, about a French experiment using 3 different kinds of robots with at a squad level. And I do think that the rise of experimentation with robotics that we've seen during the pandemic, whether it's everything from the kind of normalization of bots that check temperatures or are sanitizing, especially at the retail level at scale, like in Amazon, is also going to have ripple effects. And so, for the corners of the military that don't see this as the future or aren't willing to apply a lot of these kind of larger, concepts of operations, if you will, around human machine teaming and robotics, or even just software efficiency, not even to the most lethal or the toothier end of the force structure, but the back end, I think are really going to be missing out on some very transformative innovation. And so I think some of that positional shift is underway because of the pandemic and in part because we've been forced to live the reality, of the next decade a little bit earlier than we maybe wanted.
Peter, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Absolutely. I think what the pandemic has done has surfaced pre-existing divisions, sharpened them, as well as accelerated all sorts of different trends, including technologic trends, both in the use but also the acceptance of them. So, let's take as August hit the robotic side. Too much of the discourse about robotics is the killer robots narrative, the lethal autonomous weapon system. And that, especially on the military side, that's where much of the policy debate and discussion is. It's actually why for Burn-In, the subtitle of it, a novel of the real robotic revolution, is a bit of a pushback against that. It's the idea that no, it's, maybe one day we're going to have to figure out how to fight, killer robots. But in our lifetime, it's more about an industrial revolution. And that includes on the military side. So you think about logistics in everything from automating warehouses. We've got a scene in the book that references one of those technologies that was already in development. The effect of the pandemic is that it's accelerated the rollout of that, because the lesson that most corporations took from this is, hey, the more that we can automate, it's not just labor savings. It's whenever there's the next pandemic, we don't have to have this sort of cease in operations, so that they can frame automation on the warehouse side and the delivery side as both cost savings, but also public health measures, continuity of operations and like. Same thing on the military. And when I say delivery, it's everything from, running the warehouse, loading the truck, to the pointy end of the spear in terms of the delivery all the way to the end user. So, we had in the opening scene of the book, the characters are standing outside Union Station in DC, and you're kind of showing that it's a little bit futuristic. A wheeled delivery robot drives by on the sidewalk, delivering, doing its food delivery. Well, guess what? That was a test system. If you live in Washington, D.C., that system is operating right now, delivering groceries in DuPont Circle. It's also operating in Michigan and California to aerial delivery of food and even medicine. All is played out during this period. Drones have been used to deliver vaccines, deliver test kits and results. So in all that, the logistics side of the military, complete change. Or as August hit, distance work. We've all had that kind of, pullback. And I think I will say this, a lot of the DoD leadership thinks it's going to go back to normal after this. No. I mean, we are not going back. Distance work won't be at the same levels, but it's definitely not going back to the way it was previously. We've shown that we can do it. It's also shown that a lot of people prefer it. I saw one data point that 88% of Pentagon employees said they were more or just as productive working remotely.
I think you read that in Military.com, I'm happy to say.
Yes. Let's give a toot for the horn there. And so, we're not going to see that go back, but then there's going to be other areas where it actually goes beyond where we were before. So think about remote healthcare. On the civilian side, that industry in its own projections basically thought that it would take 10 years to get to the use that happened in the first 6 months of the pandemic. So they thought it would take about 10 years to reach where in 6 months they happened. So you think about on the military side, we're going to see that roll out as well for, both active duty to veterans, remote healthcare is where it's moving towards. But I love what, August brought up of, don't just think about the service. Think about the ripple effects of that, of, what does it do to the organization, the office experience? What does it do to the end user, the patient who's receiving that healthcare? What about the person who's working in that role? How do they not just think about their team? How do they think about themselves? And, does it alter their worldview, their politics? These are all the sort of next effects of this to come.
That's just fascinating. And it's really hard to imagine these changes happening organically without some kind of crisis like we've seen. I'd like to go into a little bit of a lightning round. And Peter, we can start with you. As I said, I've observed that the U.S. military has an extraordinary ability to take these really interesting and significant technologies and talk about them in a very mundane, generic way until everyone's eyes glaze over. So I hear all the time AI and cyber, and additive manufacturing, and they're all really neat things. And like you said, you need kind of like the scenarios to really bring it alive. So I wanted to run through a couple of sort of the most prominent emerging technologies and the exciting places that you see them going, particularly in a military context. So let's start with 3D printing or additive manufacturing.
3D printing is exciting to me, and I use it as an example of it's going to sound weird, but it's like the parallel to the Blitzkrieg. So the idea of 3D printing is it's bringing together disruptive change in both the hardware space and software space. So it's the magic of bringing those both together, much like, the Blitzkrieg was bringing together air power, new revolutionary technology of the tank, and wireless communication. That's the magic of it. 3D printing, like every other technology, used for both good and ill. So it potentially alters the entire way we think about logistics. Units being able to create their own spare parts takes us back to the definition of an arsenal. An arsenal used to be where militaries made their own weapons. Then, 1800s, they start, no private sector is going to make our weapons, and arsenal's just where we store it. So it offers that huge amount of change. However, it also offers it to adversaries. And we have already seen groups that range from drug cartels using 3D printing for smuggling to 3D printing ghost gun factories in the UK, making your own untraceable weapons. That's a cool thing that pops up in Burn-In. To China has 3D printed tools in space, which, of course, if you're thinking great power conflict, but also cool sci-fi like scenarios, you could just run wild possibilities with it.
How about, and this one's for August, manned-unmanned teaming?
This is one of the kind of grail, technologies, right, that's out there. And, you can look at some of, for example, the, air combat expressions of it, like the loyal wingman. But I feel like fundamentally you're talking about, conventional two planes, just one has a pilot, one doesn't. What gets really interesting, I think, was when you start to get into the aspects around miniaturization. So it's not so much your heroic soldier with its loyal robot dog, but imagine, a soldier with 1,000 dogs that are as big as his finger or her finger. That aspect of swarm that is, a fusion of human and machine is going to be really, really interesting to see, and probably more applicable. If you step back, this, I think, ties into robotics too. A lot of the dynamic is still focused around, the conventional platforms, if you will, just with fewer people inside them or none. The future of military robotics is probably going to be very diminutive and small. In Burn-In, our starring robot TAMS is about the size of a child. There's a lot of reasons for that, and particularly if you look at the priority environments that the U.S. Army is focusing on, say underground or dense urban areas. Having big stuff is a liability. Having small things that are attritable and disposable is going to be critical. And so to me, that's a really, I think, important aspect of it. But fundamentally, whether the size is ultimately determinative of the use, it really comes down to human being able to trust, right, that machine or algorithm is going to do exactly what it is intended to do. There's a whole host of issues that are wrapped up in that, everything from software design to countermeasures. But fundamentally, as we see these fielded more and more and less experimental capabilities, we're going to get a better sense of whether it is actually a viable future. Because I don't know necessarily either that we can assume that organizations like our own armed forces are going to figure it out on the first go round or the second. The imperative is to do so, but I don't think we want to take that for granted either.
What do you think it'll take to get that trust factor in place?
Trust is predicated on so many different elements. I think first you have to start with experimentation and getting a lot of data. There's both an analytical and an emotional aspect to trust. The second is, I think, understanding that a confidence level comes from a proximity to the technology itself. So allowing, for example, our most junior soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, to experiment and to own these elements. One of the ideas I had was kind of derived from that Tamagotchi toy, from a generation ago, was why don't young Marines, for example, who are part of a force that is trying to radically transform itself, why aren't they each issued or allowed to select from an unmanned ground, air, undersea or surface thing? It's, I don't know, the size of a phone book, if we remember what those were. And they have to care for it through, their training cycles, and they can modify it, and they can fight them, they can do whatever they want with them. But that's part of the culture, just as they learn to use a weapon. Similarly, I think, that aspect is going to be something that's very difficult bureaucratically to let go of, right? The engineering design communities don't want to do that, but I think that's critical.
This is my robot. There are many like it, but this one is mine. The next technology on my list for Peter is artificial intelligence.
We're living through not just one of the most important changes in technology, but one of the most important changes in human history when it comes to AI. I mean, in all of our human history, and what kind of distinguishes us from all the other species is our use of tools. But for the very first time, the tool it's not just altering what's in our hand, whether it's picking up a stone or operating a drone remotely, flying from Creech Air Force Base. But no, the tool is becoming increasingly intelligent, ever improving, and taking on more and more of the roles of the human themselves. I mean, this is, it is, as I said before, it's an industrial revolution. It's on the parallel of what mechanization did to society and war, but it's maybe beyond that. And that's where, if we think about the US military side, I think we're a little bit in certain areas. When I do talks on this, I'll show a picture of the battleship Arizona from 1939. And it has the float planes on the back of it. And, the battleship captains who had earlier on, said, no, airplanes don't matter. By the 1930s, they were like, yeah, I get it. Airplanes matter. They're going to make my battleship more lethal than it's ever been before. And I've given up valuable budget and deck space for airplanes. So, I get it. I get this new technology. And, of course, they really didn't get it. They were changing just enough not to change. They were layering the new technology onto what they were already doing now. And I think that's a lot of what we're doing with AI and unmanned systems right now in the military. We think we get it, but we're only changing enough not to change. A different, for the people on the ground forces side, I have this picture of it's a U.S. Army training exercise from 1931, and it's a machine gun mounted on the back of a horse-drawn wagon. We get it. We get machine guns. Just no, they're really mean change. So that to me is the AI part of it. But I wanted to go back. The key to winning out is, again, to make the history parallel, is not having, the best tanks or the most of them. It's having your plan, having how it's your doctrine, how everything fits together. And at the heart of that is that meaning of trust that you were just asking earlier about. Trust has two aspects to it. One is that sort of human emotional, I trust you. But there's also the engineering definition of trust, which is it works as expected. So I can, for example, trust that you are a liar. Now, that doesn't mean I gut trust you, but I can operate effectively in a world knowing that you're going to lie all the time, right? It's the same thing with the engineering definition of it. Does it work the way that I expect? And the hard part with AI and robotics is that we need both the human gut trust, but we need human and AI to have the second type. The human has to understand and operate as expected. So too does the AI have to understand the human. And, they have to be able to predict and project what the human wants out of them and how they're going to act. And that double meaning of trust is something that, I think is going to define how we use AI in the military and whether we use it well or not for obviously decades to come. And it makes for awesome kind of storytelling because you get, the combination of, trust is at the heart of every good novel in war to every, buddy cop TV show.
Final technology I wanted to hit on for August, simulations and virtual reality. This is something that the military talks about quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thread to pull. You can, of course, create synthetic environments now, that are rendered realistically. I do think about this maybe a little bit differently in that, when you're looking at a future force that is going to be increasingly, software driven, if not, mechanized, that the notion of training and simulation is different than just like putting on a HoloLens and, stalking around a large warehouse that's rendered, in a way that enables you to recreate a battle of the past. What I think is really interesting on the simulation and modeling side is what we're going to be able to teach machines far faster than what we can pass across, to the human elements of a force, and particularly learning how to use the sorts of operational experiences, past, present, and in the modeling sense, even future, that can be created through, adversarial networks with AI, that can really essentially allow you to fight a million battles before, gunpowder ever wafts through the air. That aspect of simulation is really critical, I think, to always kind of remember in the conversations around the way it's being done today. And certainly there is an imperative to really focusing on how to train people quickly, but we can't overlook how vital it's going to be to train the next generation of programs themselves, software, meaning AI, in the machines that it powers.
For whoever wants to take this or both, what is the biggest way that the US military gets in its own way in adopting these new technologies or embracing them? And you talked about some of the factors with trust, with not enough availability for people to familiarize themselves. But if there's one factor you could isolate that's really hindering adaptation, what would it be?
One of the bigger challenges, I think, with the current and next generation of technologies is simply understanding how to buy them. The difficulties, for example, in a backward-looking sense that the U.S. government, particularly in the defense side, has had with like IT and intelligence communities had with big software implementation projects, shows that doing any of this next generation with far more complicated, far more dynamic systems and doing so at scale is going to be really, really difficult. Particularly this is a zero defect political environment too, like for oversight perspective. And given this potential scale of investment, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but we are going to have to be in a much more permissive, I think, and risk-oriented approach to acquisitions. And maybe this is my old defense industry reporter hat, but just seeing how we are going to be, I think, ill-equipped to acquire, what we need in the current system, and working again in a universe of companies and interests, right, that are predicated on a very platform-driven, commercial model, I think is going to be something that is going to pose a lot of challenges and roadblocks. And that, of course, that affects the customer, so to speak, from an industry point of view, and from the Army being able to identify, the technologies it needs. There is also that tension too between being open to what industry can offer as well. And I'm not saying that one side in that relationship, needs to come with a complete set of expectations and understandings about the future, because that's not actually how it works if it's to be successful. But I think certainly being open to, very different acquisition paradigms, really thinking about the business model consequences and how to incentivize, people who aren't part of the traditional players to be in that space. And we may see more of that out of necessity, particularly as the threat on the software side, from countries like China, and on the AI side from countries like Russia, begins to force us to act. Again, budget is everything too. I mean, our AI budget in the US is on defense spending is not very aggressive. And so it's hard to kind of see it as a real priority until, for example, some of those numbers change.
1000% agreement with August on that. Another one I would put on top, and it's interesting, it's not just an issue for defense, but it's also in public health. We Americans don't do a good job of learning lessons from others and applying them into our own policy. Public health, there were clearly better ways to go after the pandemic. The US is not the shining example of it. There was no lack of warning. There was no lack of information. There was no lack of budget. It was just not applying the lessons of nations who handle it better. It's the same thing when we think about warfare. Go back to IEDs and Iraq and Afghanistan. We acted like it was some kind of, new thing, new challenge. And yet this was an old technology that had been used in lots of other spaces, or the use of unmanned systems by ISIS. We had years of warning, had seen it play out in Lebanon. And yet when it's used against us, we're like, oh, where did this come from? And if we look around today, the same phenomena is playing out, whether it's different ways of using unmanned systems, the ways that the Israelis used them disposably as far back as 1982, to then the Turks and their proxies used them the same ways in the Libyan civil war, to really great, and I think for a lot of people, pretty shocking effectiveness in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's an example of a very different kind of use of unmanned aerial systems. Or to your earlier question about AI, the PLA certainly has equally recognized the importance of AI, but appears to be going after it in a different kind of manner. So to echo what August was saying about training, for them, their leadership, the magic moment with AI was the game of Go. And when an AI beat the best human overall at Go, and a lot of people, oh, that's like what happened in chess. But for them, it was not that. It was how it did it. It was that the AI won by using moves that no human had conceived of in the literally thousands of years that humans had been playing Go. So for them, that was the magic moment. Or to the size question that we were talking about earlier, while the US military is, for the most part, moved towards kind of the larger size systems, the robotic wingmen and the like, there's some writing in PLA military journals that, they say in terms of the translation is the new concepts of war. The rough quote is that in the future of war, the small but many will defeat the large but few. Who do they think the large but few user is? I think that's us. And I would just say as an overall, we need to do a better job of kind of looking out there. How are other nations coming up with new concepts? And in certain situations, we got to do a better job of applying them.
So that's what's next for the military. What is next for you all, either together or individually? So are there any new collaborations in the work or fic int that I can look forward to reading?
One of the things that Pete and I have been working on is, this aspect of using the same approaches to Ghost Fleet and Burn-In, as he said earlier, with, other military groups, the Australian Defence College. In this piece that we wrote, we're trying to really kind of kickstart a different kind of conversation about PME. And so by really showing, what the future of not only PME, but the operational implications of it, could hold was a really good example of that. And that's very much, where our energies are going, is working with different groups, the US and allied communities, on these kinds of projects. And what's, heartening to see is being able to, share these things widely, right? These all end up in the open domain so far. And that, I think, fundamentally speaks to the power of this useful fiction approach, which is trying to connect as many people as possible together, through these kinds of narratives.
What's been fun about it is in some situations, it's us taking their ideas, their strategy papers, their trend reports, and turning them into narratives, whether it was with the Australians or we did a project with NATO, another one with US Congress that helped visualize a strategy paper on cybersecurity. And then in other situations, it's actually been us helping to mentor and teach other people how to do it. So we've run training exercises, or basically call them executive education short courses for groups that range from the Air Force's futures team to 1-star generals and senior executive service. And it's funny, everybody, they will go into like, I can't do narrative, I can't do forecasting. And then by the end, they're producing these awesome ideas that, I'm jealous of. But the whole point of it is not just to be creative. It goes back to where we started the conversation. It's for them to get their own skill set at both projecting, but also explaining, not just in fiction formats, but we all need to do a better job of explaining and communicating, whether it's in a speech, whether it's in a memo, and the skills cut across that. So it's been a lot of fun to play, not just on the creator side, but on the mentor side with these groups.
That's phenomenal. Well, thank you so much for your time, for bringing me up to speed on all these things. I've loved reading your work, and I hope to continue to follow it. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for the interest and for having us on the podcast.
Thanks once again for joining us here at Left of Boom. This is our 20th episode, and it has been a true honor to have these conversations and dive deeper into the most fascinating and transformative topics affecting military life. There's much, much more goodness to come. In our next episode, for example, we'll be looking at the Marines United social media scandal that forced a service-wide reckoning, and what has changed in the 4 years since then. Please take time to rate and review Left of Boom wherever you listen, and stay subscribed so you don't miss a future episode. And remember, you can find all the news and information affecting the military community every single day at Military.com.